If you want to understand Nero Wolfe, you need to understand that his daily schedule is not a suggestion. It's a constitutional amendment. From 9 to 11 and 4 to 6, he's in the plant rooms with his orchids, and during those hours, the world below might as well be on fire for all the attention he'll pay it. From 11 to 1, he's in the office, available for the kind of intellectual challenges that don't bore him to tears. The rest of the time, he's eating, reading, or glowering at anyone who dares suggest he might want to leave his chair. On this particular Wednesday morning in October, I was enjoying the peaceful interlude that comes with knowing exactly where the boss was, and that he couldn't come thundering down to criticize my filing system or my coffee consumption. Fritz was in the kitchen, probably debating the merits of Hungarian paprika versus Spanish, and I was at my desk, working through the morning mail and wondering if the Dodgers would ever figure out how to hit a curveball. That's when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite, measured chime of someone who'd made an appointment. This was the insistent, repeated buzzing of someone who either had an emergency or had never learned proper manners. Since emergencies in our line of work tend to come with retainer checks attached, I set down my coffee and went to see what fresh variety of human folly had arrived on our doorstep. The woman standing there looked like she'd stepped out of one of those museum catalogues that arrive in the mail with pictures of expensive vases nobody actually uses. Mid-40s, with the kind of understated elegance that costs more than most people's cars. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that managed to look both professional and slightly windblown, and she wore a charcoal wool coat that had clearly never seen the inside of a department store. But it was her eyes that caught my attention. They held the particular combination of determination and barely controlled panic that I'd learned to recognize in people who'd stumbled onto something they wished they hadn't. Mr. Goodwin. Her voice had the cultured precision of someone who'd spent years giving lectures to people who wrote large donation checks. I'm Iris Voss. I telephoned yesterday about seeing Mr. Wolfe. I remembered the call. She'd been polite but persistent, mentioning something about a matter of institutional urgency that required discreet professional consultation. I'd given her the standard speech about appointments, fees, and Wolfe's particular requirements for taking cases. Come in, Ms. Voss. Mr. Wolfe will be down from the plant rooms in about an hour. Can I offer you coffee while you wait? She stepped into the hall with the careful movements of someone who was used to being surrounded by fragile, valuable things. That would be very kind, thank you. I led her into the office and settled her in the red leather chair facing Wolfe's desk. While I poured coffee from Fritz's perpetually fresh supply, I took the opportunity to study our visitor more carefully. The nervous energy I'd noticed at the door was more pronounced now. Her hands weren't quite steady as she accepted the cup, and she kept glancing around the room as if cataloguing potential escape routes. Impressive collection, she said, nodding toward the bookshelves that lined the walls. I spend my days surrounded by beautiful objects, but there's something particularly satisfying about books that are clearly read rather than merely displayed. Wolfe would appreciate that observation, I said, settling behind my desk. He has strong opinions about people who collect books as decoration. Now, about this institutional urgency you mentioned on the phone. Ms. Voss set down her coffee cup with the precise care of someone who'd spent years handling irreplaceable objects. I'm the executive director of the Quillian Museum of Decorative Arts on East 73rd Street. We specialize in domestic objects with historical significance, porcelain, silver, furniture, that sort of thing. 3 days ago, one of our most prominent trustees died during a fundraising event at the museum. I'm sorry for your loss, I said, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't entirely a condolence call. Thank you. Cyrus Brand was a complicated man, but he was genuinely devoted to the museum. He died of what the medical examiner determined was a cerebral aneurysm, very sudden, very tragic. She paused, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. The event was a trustees' tea, Mr. Brand's idea, actually. He thought it would be charming to serve tea from pieces in our collection. I felt the first stirring of genuine interest. And something about this tea party has brought you to our door. Yesterday morning, I found something on my desk that shouldn't have been there. She opened her purse and withdrew a small tissue-wrapped bundle. This is a teacup from our Marie Gabrielle service, 18th century Vincennes porcelain. It should have been safely displayed in its case, but someone had removed it, used it, and left it in my office with a note. She unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a delicate white porcelain cup decorated with pale blue forget-me-nots. Even to my untrained eye, it was clearly something special, the kind of object that belonged behind glass, with a placard explaining its historical significance. But there was also something wrong with it. A hairline crack ran down from the rim, so fine it was barely visible. "The note," I said. Ms. Voss reached into her purse again and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It said, "This one ended a life." Typed, no signature. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar tingle that comes when a case starts to take shape. "You think someone is suggesting that Mr. Brand's death wasn't as natural as it appeared?" "I don't know what to think," she said, and for the first time her professional composure cracked slightly. "But I know that if word of this gets out, if anyone suggests that our trustee's tea was anything other than a tragic coincidence, it will destroy the museum. We're not the Metropolitan, Mr. Goodwin. We survive on the goodwill and trust of our donors. Scandal would kill us." Just then, I heard the familiar whir of the elevator descending from the plant rooms. Ms. Voss straightened in her chair, and I saw her take a deep breath, preparing herself for the encounter with the great man himself. The office door opened, and Nero Wolfe entered with his usual measured pace. A seventh of a ton of flesh and intellect, moving with the deliberate precision of someone who never wasted energy on unnecessary motion. He nodded politely to Ms. Voss, walked around his desk, and lowered himself into his custom-built chair with a barely audible sigh of satisfaction. "Miss Voss." His voice was a low rumble, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "Archie tells me you have concerns about a teacup and a deceased trustee." "Yes, Mr. Wolfe. I hope you can help me." She launched into her story again, but I noticed she was watching his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. Wolfe naturally gave her nothing. He sat perfectly still, his eyes half closed, his fingers interlaced over his considerable belly. When she finished, he remained silent for nearly a minute. Ms. Voss fidgeted with her purse, and I could practically hear her wondering if she'd made a mistake coming here. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "This teacup, it was part of a service used at your fundraising event?" "Yes. Dr. Leland Yuan, one of our trustees, suggested we use pieces from the collection. He's quite knowledgeable about tea and thought it would add authenticity to the occasion." "And who had access to remove and return this particular cup?" "Several people, unfortunately. Myself, Dr. Maxwell Pender, our chief curator, Tamsin Keats, our restoration specialist, the event staff, security, theoretically, though they rarely pay attention to individual pieces being moved for legitimate purposes." Wolfe nodded slowly. "The crack in the porcelain. When did you first notice it?" "Yesterday, when I found it on my desk. It definitely wasn't there before the tea. We condition report all pieces before and after any use." "And Mr. Brand's death. You were present?" Miss Voss's hands tightened on her purse. "Yes, it was horrible. He was in the middle of a conversation with Mrs. Beatrice Harland, she's another trustee, when he suddenly gasped and collapsed. The paramedics said there was nothing anyone could have done." Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was a dramatic gesture. "Ms. Voss, I will accept your case on the condition that you provide me with complete information about your museum, your trustees, your staff, and any tensions or conflicts that might be relevant. Complete information, if you attempt to protect reputations or shield anyone From scrutiny, I will terminate our arrangement immediately." "Of course, Mr. Wolfe. I understand completely." But I could tell from her expression that she didn't understand at all. She thought she could control what information she shared and what she kept hidden. In my experience, that never worked out well for the client. Wolfe quoted his fee, $10,000 plus expenses, and Ms. Voss wrote a check without hesitation. As I walked her to the door, she turned back to me. "Mr. Goodwin, there's something else. We have a board meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. All the trustees will be there, along with key staff members, if you and Mr. Wolfe would like to observe." "We'll be in touch," I said, closing the door behind her. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was sitting motionless, staring at the teacup which Miss Voss had left on his desk. "Interesting case," I said. "A mysterious note, a cracked teacup, and a death that may or may not be suspicious. What's your read?" Wolfe looked up at me with the expression he reserves for occasions when the obvious has been stated unnecessarily. "Archie, someone has gone to considerable trouble to suggest that Mr. Brand's death was not natural, while simultaneously ensuring that any investigation would focus on Miss Voss and her museum." "A setup?" "Precisely. The question is whether the setup is designed to conceal a genuine crime or to create the appearance of one." He picked up the teacup with surprising delicacy for such large hands. "Either way, someone has made the mistake of assuming that a few theatrical gestures would be sufficient to manipulate the outcome." I had to admit he had a point. The whole thing felt staged. The dramatic placement of the cup, the anonymous note, the timing of the discovery. But staged by whom, and for what purpose? "Instructions?" I asked. "Contact Saul Panzer. Have him begin discreet inquiries about the financial situation of the Quillian Museum and the personal circumstances of its trustees. Then call Inspector Kramer and ask him what the medical examiner's report actually said about Mr. Brand's death." Wolfe set the teacup down carefully. "And Archie, arrange for us to attend that board meeting on Friday. I suspect it will be most illuminating." As I reached for the phone, I couldn't help but smile. Another case, another chance to watch Wolfe work his particular brand of intellectual magic. And this time, it involved a teacup that might or might not have ended a life. In the world of Nero Wolfe, stranger things had happened before breakfast. The game, as they say, was afoot. If you want to understand what makes Nero Wolfe tick, you need to appreciate that his daily routine isn't just a schedule, it's a constitutional principle. The brownstone operates on the clockwork precision of his habits, and when that rhythm gets disrupted, you can practically feel the building's foundations shift. Thursday morning started with the kind of methodical investigation work that keeps the machinery humming. Phone calls, fact-gathering, and the careful assembly of information that Wolfe transforms into deductive gold. My first call was to Saul Panzer, who answered on the second ring with his usual economy of words. I gave him the assignment: financial deep dive on the Quillian Museum, background checks on the trustees, any whispers of money troubles or personal complications. Saul's response was a grunt that somehow conveyed both understanding and professional enthusiasm. If there were skeletons in anyone's closet, Saul would have them catalogued and cross-referenced by evening. Inspector Kramer was my next target, and as expected, he greeted my inquiry with all the warmth of a February morning in the Bronx. "Goodwin, what's Wolfe stirring up now?" "Brand died of a brain aneurysm. Clean toxicology, no suspicious circumstances. If you're fishing for a murder case, you're in the wrong pond." "Just gathering information, Inspector." A client has some questions about a teacup that may have been involved. The silence on the other end was pregnant with the kind of skepticism that Kramer reserves for anything that sounds remotely like one of Wolfe's theatrical investigations. "A teacup? You're telling me Wolfe's chasing shadows over dishware?" "Porcelain, actually. 18th century Vincennes, very valuable, very delicate, and very cracked. I let that hang in the air, knowing Kramer's instincts would eventually overcome his irritation. "Bring me something concrete, Goodwin, or keep your crockery theories to yourself." He hung up, but I could tell the seed was planted. Kramer might grumble, but he hated being caught flat-footed more than he hated admitting Wolfe might be on to something. The morning's peace was shattered at 10:15 when the doorbell announced the arrival of our first uninvited guest. Dr. Maxwell Pender stood on our doorstep with the kind of dignified composure that comes from years of explaining valuable objects to people who write large checks. Tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed, he had the bearing of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, at least until he encountered Nero Wolfe. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm Dr. Pender from the Quillian Museum. I believe Miss Voss consulted with Mr. Wolfe about our recent difficulties." His tone suggested these difficulties were minor inconveniences that reasonable people should be able to resolve without fuss. I led him into the office, where he settled into the red leather chair with the careful movements of someone who spent his days surrounded by irreplaceable artifacts. While I poured coffee, I studied our visitor. Unlike Miss Voss's nervous energy, Dr. Pender projected calm authority, but there was something underneath, a tightness around his eyes that suggested his confidence wasn't quite as solid as his presentation. "Impressive collection," he said, nodding toward Wolfe's bookshelves. "Several first editions that would be quite at home in our rare books section." "Wolfe believes books should be read, not displayed," I replied. "He has strong opinions about people who treat literature like museum pieces." Dr. Pender's smile was thin enough to slice cheese. "Preservation and accessibility are often in tension. It's one of the fundamental challenges in our field." The elevators whir announced Wolfe's descent from the plant rooms. Dr. Pender straightened slightly, preparing himself for the encounter with the great man. When Wolfe entered and settled into his chair with his customary sigh of satisfaction, he took in our visitor with a single comprehensive glance. "Dr. Pender, Ms. Voss mentioned you as the museum's chief curator." 18 years with the Quillian, the last 7 as chief curator." Dr. Pender leaned forward with the earnest intensity of someone making an important point. "Mr. Wolfe, I want to be perfectly clear about something. Cyrus Brand died of natural causes. The medical examiner was quite definitive. Whatever theatrical nonsense someone has concocted with teacups and anonymous notes doesn't change the medical facts." Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "You seem remarkably certain about someone else's motives." "I'm certain about facts. Cyrus had high blood pressure. He was under considerable stress about the museum's finances. The idea that someone tampered with his tea is absurd." I noticed he jumped straight to tampering without any prompting. "Ms. Voss didn't mention poison, Dr. Pender. That's an interesting assumption." His composure slipped just enough to be visible. "I simply meant, well, what else could the implication be? If someone's suggesting the teacup was involved in his death." Wolfe studied him with the patient attention of a cat watching a mouse hole. "Dr. Pender, what can you tell me about the tensions among the museum's trustees?" "Tensions?" His laugh had the forced quality of someone trying to deflect an uncomfortable question. "Mr. Wolfe, we're discussing a small cultural institution, not a corporate boardroom. Our trustees are dedicated individuals who care deeply about preserving decorative arts." That wasn't what I asked. The silence stretched until Dr. Pender finally sighed. "There have been some disagreements about direction. Cyrus favored a more aggressive approach to acquisitions and fundraising. Others felt we should focus on properly maintaining what we already have." Before Wolfe could pursue this line of questioning, the doorbell rang again. If we were going to have a parade of visitors, I figured we might as well make it a proper one. This time I found a woman in her 30s with the kind of practical elegance that comes from working with your hands around priceless objects. Her red hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple black dress under a well-tailored coat. But it was her hands that caught my attention. They moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling things that couldn't be replaced if dropped. "You must be Mr. Goodwin. I'm Tamsin Keats from the museum. Is Dr. Pender here? I saw him leaving and thought—" She trailed off, clearly having second thoughts about whatever impulse had brought her to our door. "He's in the office with Mr. Wolfe." "Come in." When I led her into the office, the sight of Dr. Pender clearly flustered her. "Maxwell, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought—" "Miss Keats." Wolfe's voice cut through her stammering. "You're the museum's restoration specialist." "Yes, sir. I work primarily with porcelain and ceramics." She remained standing despite my gesture toward the yellow chair, her eyes drawn immediately to the Marie Gabrielle teacup on Wolfe's desk. "Then you examined this piece before and after the trustees' tea?" Tamsin glanced nervously at Dr. Pender. "I did the condition report before the event. The piece was perfect. And afterward, I didn't get a chance to examine it afterward. Ms. Voss said it had been returned to storage, but when I went to check yesterday morning, it wasn't there." Dr. Pender frowned. "Tamsin, you didn't mention this yesterday. I thought maybe it had been moved for cleaning or photography. It wasn't until Ms. Voss found it in her office that I realized." She stopped, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "Miss Keats, in your professional opinion, how was that hairline crack created?" "Thermal shock. A sudden temperature change. If someone poured very hot liquid into a room temperature cup or cold liquid into a heated cup, it could cause exactly that kind of damage. Would such damage be immediately visible?" "Not necessarily. Sometimes stress fractures don't become apparent until hours later, depending on the severity of the temperature differential." Dr. Pender stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. We're discussing the thermal properties of porcelain when we should be focusing on the fact that someone is trying to create a scandal where none exists." Wolfe ignored him, keeping his attention on Tamsin. "Ms. Keats, who else has the expertise to recognize such damage?" "Anyone with experience in ceramics restoration. Dr. Yuan certainly would. He's quite knowledgeable about Chinese porcelain. Mrs. Harland collects 18th century pieces, so she'd probably notice." "And—" She hesitated. "Yes? Well, Cyrus Brand was very particular about the condition of pieces in the collection. He would have noticed a crack like that immediately." The room fell silent. Dr. Pender was staring at Tamsin with an expression that suggested she'd just committed professional heresy. Tamsin herself looked like she wished she could disappear into the upholstery. The doorbell rang a third time, and I was beginning to think we should install a turnstile. This arrival brought Dr. Leland Yuan, a man who seemed to have been carved from polished teak, lean, meticulously dressed in a bespoke suit, with the precise, analytical demeanor of someone accustomed to dissecting complex problems. His eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, had the steady gaze of a scholar who'd learned to read between the lines of history. Before I could even get him settled, the bell rang again. This time it was Mrs. Beatrice Harland, a woman of formidable presence draped in expensive fabrics and radiating the unshakable confidence that comes with old money and older opinions. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and her jewelry gleamed with understated opulence. She swept into the office, her gaze immediately locking onto Dr. Yuan. "Leland, what an unexpected pleasure. I confess, when Mr. Goodwin called, I assumed it was a private consultation." Yuan offered a tight smile. "Indeed, Beatrice. It seems Mr. Wolfe has a rather broad definition of privacy." The air in the room thickened with the subtle tension of two predators who'd found themselves unexpectedly sharing hunting grounds. Wolfe, as always, remained a granite monument, his eyes moving slowly between them, absorbing every nuance. "Mrs. Harland," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the polite sparring, "you were with Mr. Brand at the moment of his collapse." Her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. I was. We were discussing the upcoming gala when he simply collapsed. It was quite sudden and shocking. And Dr. Yuan, you proposed using the museum's collection for the tea ceremony. A charming idea, I thought. Yuan replied, adjusting his glasses, to bring the collection to life, as it were. Cyrus was particularly enthusiastic about it. Enthusiastic, perhaps, Mrs. Harland interjected, but also rather overbearing. He insisted on particular pieces, even when the staff expressed concerns about their fragility. She shot a pointed look at Yuan. Yuan's jaw tightened. Cyrus had a vision for the museum, Beatrice. A vision that some found inconvenient. Wolfe steepled his fingers over his considerable belly. His eyes half closed in the pose I'd learned meant he was processing information at maximum capacity. The brownstone's usual sanctuary of quiet intellectual pursuit had become a stage for subtle drama, and the players, despite their polished exteriors, were already showing cracks in their composure, much like a certain porcelain teacup. "Dr. Pender, Miss Keats," Wolfe said finally, "I'll need to speak with each of you individually, along with the other trustees and staff members who were present at the tea. Archie will arrange appointments." It wasn't a request, and everyone in the room recognized that. After they left, Dr. Pender with stiff formality, Tamsin with obvious relief, and the two trustees with the wary courtesy of people who'd been maneuvered into a position they didn't entirely understand. I settled back at my desk. "Interesting dynamic," I observed. "Pender's trying to shut down the investigation before it starts. Keats just handed us crucial information about timing, and those two trustees have enough tension between them to power the subway system." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Indeed. If Mr. Brand would have immediately noticed the crack, and if thermal shock can take hours to become visible, then the sequence of events becomes quite significant. You think Brand discovered something that got him killed? I think, Archie, that someone has been very clever about the timing of revelations and the placement of evidence, but not quite clever enough." He picked up the teacup with surprising delicacy. "This afternoon, contact the remaining trustees and staff members. I want them all here tomorrow morning. And call Saul. Tell him to pay particular attention to any recent changes in insurance policies or loan arrangements involving museum pieces." As I reached for the phone, I couldn't help but smile. The brownstone had been thoroughly disturbed, but Wolfe was beginning to weave his web. And when Nero Wolfe starts pulling strings, the results are usually worth the disruption to our peaceful routine. The game was definitely afoot, and it was shaping up to be one of his more interesting performances. If you think rounding up suspects is as simple as handing out subpoenas, you've never tried it in a brownstone where the boss's patience for milling is about as thin as Fritz's veal cutlets. By Friday morning, our sacred routine had been replaced by a parade of high-strung museum types, each carrying enough emotional baggage to stock a Pullman car. My job, besides keeping the coffee hot, was to observe, record, and prod. Wolfe's job, as usual, was to remain an immovable object, letting the world come to him. I started the day with a call from Saul Panzer, who, as ever, had managed to get deeper into the museum's finances than most auditors could with a month and a subpoena. The Quillians' endowment looks healthy on paper, but they're floating a line of credit to keep the lights on, Saul reported. Brand was pushing for a loan against restricted funds. Harland threatened to pull her family endowment if they went through with it. Yuan promised a big collection loan, but only if he got a gallery named after him. Pender's fighting any deaccessions. Voss is stuck in the middle, 3 sides pushing, a 4th counting the till. That gave Wolfe enough to start picking the labels off motives, so when the suspects started arriving, he was ready. Iris Voss came first, the executive director and our client. She had the look of someone who'd spent the night rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. When I pressed her about the anonymous note and the teacup left on her desk, she hesitated. "Only 3 people have keys to my office. myself, Dr. Pender, and Dana Reeves, our operations manager. Security can buzz others in, but it's not exactly Fort Knox. As for Brand, she described generosity and impatience, with a tension between his taste for bold gestures and her need for stability. Dr. Maxwell Pender, chief curator, arrived next, wearing his authority like a slightly too tight suit. He insisted he'd advised against using the Marie Gabrielle service for anything but demonstration. Brand overruled the spirit, if not the letter, he said. When I mentioned Tamsin's appraisal killing a promised gift, he bristled. Ms. Keats is conscientious, but sometimes overcautious. One mustn't alienate donors by impugning their taste. I pointed out that accepting reproductions as originals was its own risk, and he snapped, "That is not what occurred," then closed up faster than a clam in a red tide. Tamsin Keats, restoration specialist, sounded like she'd been waiting for a pardon. I wrote the appraisal because the piece was wrong, a 19th century pastiche. The donor was angry. Brand was angrier. After that, Brand talked about outsourcing conservation. I still have my job, but I stopped getting invited to donor events. She confirmed she had conducted the pre-event condition report on the Marie Gabrielle cup, which was perfect then, but didn't get to check it immediately after the trustees' tea. Dr. Leland Yuan, trustee and porcelain scholar, arrived with the poise of a man who'd spent his life lecturing on Ming Dynasty glazes. He spoke at length about the educational value of experiencing porcelain as it was intended, supporting Brand's bold moves in public, but hinting at private leverage, his promised collection and the strings attached. When I probed about the named gallery and whether Brand had overplayed his hand, he replied, Brand was not brandished, but others brandished him. Mrs. Beatrice Harland, old money and older standards, was the last to arrive. She claimed she'd been talking governance with Brand when he died and had specifically threatened to involve the Attorney General if restricted funds were touched. She dismissed the tea ceremony as a stunt and had no patience for what she called momentum mistaken for progress. When I asked if she collected Vinson, she said, I collect standards. As the interviews wrapped, Fritz appeared in the doorway, apologetic. Excuse me, Mr. Wolfe. There's a gentleman from the insurance company, Vincent Carstairs, wishes to speak with you urgently. Carstairs, thin and nervous, clutched his briefcase like a lifeboat. Mr. Wolfe, I'm with the company handling the Quillian's collection insurance. The Marie Gabrielle service was scheduled for reappraisal next week. We received a request for increased coverage on several pieces, including that cup, just weeks before the incident. The timing is troubling. Who initiated the request? Wolfe asked, eyes narrowing. Officially, Ms. Voss, as executive director. But the paperwork matches Dr. Pender's handwriting, and the valuation schedule tracks market trends with remarkable precision. Pender looked as if he'd swallowed a lemon. Routine procedure. The market, for 18th century Vincents, has been volatile. Voss's voice was tight. I signed what Maxwell handed me. I trusted his expertise. Wolfe steepled his fingers. A cup insured for more, then damaged and left as a clue. A death ambiguous in cause, but with the suggestion of foul play. Tell me, Mr. Carstairs, would an insurance claim pay out if the damage was intentional? Only if accidental. If there's suspicion of fraud, we investigate, and the claim can be denied. Thank you, Wolfe said, dismissing him with a nod. When the room cleared, Wolfe looked at me, eyes half closed in contemplation. 5 with motive, 5 with access. 1 cup that speaks of heat and time, an insurance policy that grew fat before the incident, and a note that says, this one ended a life. Someone wishes us to look at the cup and at Miss Voss while keeping their own hands clean. Frame job? I asked. Or pressure? If the museum is tainted by scandal, Voss's position is in jeopardy, and so are the rival ambitions circling the board. The insurance policy, the rejected donation, the threatened endowment, all are strings in the same knot. He paused, considering. Tomorrow, Archie, we will observe the board meeting. Meanwhile, ask Saul to identify the donor whose gift was rejected and to check who authorized the insurance increase and why. The answer, I suspect, will be found not in the porcelain, but in the hands that moved it, and why they wished to leave a trail. I made my notes. The circle was drawn. The cup, innocent or not, sat in the center, and Wolfe, immovable as ever, was quietly tightening the net. If the cup had ended a life, it wasn't talking. The people, however, were, each word, each hesitation, a step closer to the truth. When Nero Wolfe sends you out to do what he calls legwork, he doesn't mean jogging around Central Park. He means using your feet to get places, your eyes to see things, and your mouth to ask the kind of questions that make people forget they were planning to lie. Friday morning found me armed with Wolfe's instructions, Saul's preliminary findings, and my own considerable talent for making conversation with people who'd rather be talking to anyone else. My first stop was the Quillian Museum itself, where I wanted to get a feel for the operational side of things before the board meeting circus began. Dana Reeves, the operations manager, met me in the lobby with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage other people's crises without creating her own. "Miss Voss said to give you whatever you need," she said, leading me through corridors lined with glass cases full of objects that looked both priceless and fragile. "Within reason." "Let's test those boundaries," I said. "Walk me through the trustee's tea from your end, the practical details that don't make it into the society page coverage." Dana had the kind of memory that comes from years of managing events where a single mistake could cost someone's job. The tea was staged in the Green Gallery, 3 serving stations, Chinese teas for Dr. Yuan's demonstration, English blends at the main station, and herbals for the health-conscious trustees. We used museum pieces as requested, the Marie Gabrielle service at the English station, some yixing pots for the Chinese teas, and a Georgian silver service for the herbal. Whose idea was using the collection pieces? Mr. Brand's, officially. But Dr. Yuan suggested it first, and Dr. Pender signed off on the specific selections. She paused at a door marked "Staff Only." "The prep room is through here. I can show you the setup." The prep room was a study in institutional efficiency, stainless steel surfaces, industrial sinks, and the kind of organization that comes from handling irreplaceable objects on a daily basis. Dana pointed to a large electric urn with a warning label. "Do not boil dry." We used this for the hot water. The Chinese station had its own setup. Dr. Yuan brought his own equipment for the proper ceremony, but all the washing and prep work happened here. And after the event, "Chaos," she said simply. Mr. Brand collapsed. The paramedics arrived. Trustees were in shock. The catering staff cleared the serving stations and brought everything back here, but I was dealing with the emergency. I locked the Green Gallery, posted security, and went home around 11. When I came in Thursday morning, the Marie Gabrielle teacup was missing from the return tray. Security logs? She led me to a cramped office that smelled like strong coffee and old paper. The logbook was a model of neat handwriting. Pike, the night security guard, had recorded every entry and exit with military precision. According to his entries, the last trustee left at 10:11 p.m., the paramedics departed at 11:02, and Pike had done his final rounds at 12:03 a.m. "Pike's been here 12 years, Dana said. "If he says nobody came back in, nobody came back in." "What about internal access? Who has keys to Miss Voss's office?" "Ms. Voss, Dr. Pender, and myself. Security has a master key, but it's signed out and logged." She opened another ledger. "We had the office door's strike plate replaced last month. The latch sticks if you don't pull it tight. If someone thought it was locked." She let that hang in the air, and I could practically hear Wolfe making one of his small approving sounds. A door that might not be as secure as it appeared. That was the kind of detail that turned cases. My next stop was Pike himself, who had the bearing of a man who'd spent his career keeping valuable things safe from people who shouldn't have them. He was in his 60s, with the careful posture of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "Terrible thing, Mr. Brand's passing," he said, settling his cap on his knee. "Good man, always had a word for the staff." "Tell me about that night, after the paramedics left." Pike's account was precise and unembellished. "Cleared the building by 11:15. Did my first round at 11:30, all secure. Second round at midnight, final at 12:30. Building was locked tight. Anyone try to get back in? Fellow from the Tribune tried the front door around 11:45. Told him to come back during visiting hours like everyone else. What about the prep room? Did you check it during your rounds? Every room, every floor. That's the job." Pike's voice carried the quiet pride of a man who'd never missed a detail in 12 years of service. From the museum, I headed uptown to visit Hollis Grieve, the collector whose generous gift had been rejected after Tamsin Keats' inconveniently accurate appraisal. Grieve lived in one of those Fifth Avenue apartments where the rent could fund a small museum, and he received me in a sitting room that showcased his taste for expensive objects and his talent for holding grudges. "That woman, that restoration specialist, humiliated me," he said, pacing behind a sofa that probably cost more than my car. 30 years of collecting, and she has the audacity to call my prize piece a 19th century pastiche. But it was a reproduction. Grieve's laugh was bitter. Reproduction, pastiche, inspired interpretation. The terminology matters less than the intent. I was offering the museum a relationship with a serious collector. And Mr. Brand's position? Cyrus understood the bigger picture initially. He knew you don't insult major donors over academic quibbles. But after that girl's report, he started wavering. Talked about maintaining standards, protecting the museum's reputation. Grave stopped pacing and fixed me with a stare, as if my reputation counted for nothing. I noticed a typewriter on a side table, an old Remington with character. The E key tilted slightly to the left, giving it a distinctive look. I filed that detail away for future reference. "Did you attend the trustees' tea?" "Briefly." Arrived, observed the proceedings, left. I don't socialize with people who've questioned my expertise. His tone suggested the wound was still fresh. "Before the rejection, did you offer any advice about the event? Suggestions about which pieces to use?" Grave's expression shifted slightly. "I may have mentioned that the Marie Gabriel service would photograph beautifully for their publicity. And I did warn them about thermal shock. 18th century porcelain can be quite fragile when subjected to sudden temperature changes." That was interesting. The rejected donor had not only recommended the specific piece that was later damaged, but had also provided the technical knowledge of how such damage might occur. My final interview was with Dr. Yuan at his private office in Midtown. Yuan received me with the careful courtesy of a man who'd spent his career navigating between scholarship and commerce. His office reflected both sides of his nature. Scholarly books and journals mixed with the kind of expensive furnishings that suggested his expertise was financially rewarding. "Mr. Brand's death was unfortunate," he said, settling behind a desk that belonged in an architectural magazine, "but perhaps not entirely unexpected. He'd been under considerable stress. The museum's financial situation, conflicts with the board, health issues he refused to acknowledge." "Health issues?" "Hypertension, certainly. Headaches, occasional dizzy spells." I suggested he see a physician, but Cyrus was resistant to showing weakness. Yuan confirmed that he'd originally suggested using collection pieces for the tea ceremony, but insisted the specific selections had been Brand's choice. I provided scholarly context, nothing more. And your promised collection? The one that comes with naming rights? The Leland Yuan Gallery of Asian Ceramics, 200 pieces, valued at approximately $8 million. His smile was precise. The arrangement was contingent on certain governance changes that Mr. Brand was advocating. With his death, those changes are less certain, such as a more aggressive acquisition policy, expanded exhibition space, increased emphasis on Asian art, the kind of vision that requires strong leadership and board support. As I prepared to leave, Yuan mentioned something that caught my attention. There has been one complication since Mr. Brand's death. A provenance document for one of the Chinese export pieces has gone missing from the archives. Dr. Pender was quite upset about it. He needs it for insurance purposes. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in his chair, contemplating the cracked teacup as if it held the secrets of the universe. Fritz had left a plate of something that proved civilization could be served with a fork, and I helped myself while organizing my thoughts. "Report," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. I gave it to him systematically. Dana's timeline and the sticky door latch, Pike's meticulous security logs, Greaves' wounded pride and technical knowledge, Yuan's contingent collection, and the missing provenance document. Wolfe's eyes opened at thermal shock, and again at missing document. "Interesting," he said, shifting slightly in his chair. "Mr. Greaves recommended the specific piece that was later damaged and possessed the knowledge to cause such damage. Dr. Yuan's generous gift depends on changes that died with Mr. Brand, and now a document that Dr. Pender needs has mysteriously vanished. The insurance angle is interesting too," I added. "Pender initiated the coverage increase on the Marie Gabrielle service just a week after Greaves' piece was rejected. That's either remarkable timing or remarkable planning." Wolfe picked up the teacup, turning it slowly in his large hands. "The sequence is significant, Archie. The rejection, the insurance increase, the missing document, and finally the damaged cup with its theatrical note. Someone has been very busy orchestrating events. Frame job or misdirection? If someone wished to suggest that Mr. Brand's death was unnatural, they would need evidence that pointed away from themselves and toward another culprit. The cup, the note, the timing of the discovery, all very convenient for creating suspicion while obscuring the real crime." He set the teacup down with a decisive click. "Tomorrow's board meeting should be illuminating. The players will be assembled, the tensions will be high, and someone will make the mistake of revealing more than they intended." I made my notes, feeling the familiar anticipation that comes when a case starts to take shape. The legwork was done, the suspects were identified, and Wolfe was beginning to weave the threads together. All that remained was to watch the performance and see who stumbled when the spotlight found them. The game, as they say, was definitely afoot. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes you appreciate being indoors with Fritz's coffee and the certainty that some things in this world remain constant. Wolfe was in the plant rooms with his orchids. I was at my desk reviewing notes for the afternoon's board meeting, and Fritz was in his kitchen, preparing what would undoubtedly be another masterpiece disguised as breakfast. The brownstone hummed with its usual peaceful efficiency, until Fritz appeared in the office doorway, wearing an expression that suggested someone had committed a capital crime against the natural order. "Archie," he said, his accent thickening with distress. "Someone has been in my kitchen." In the Wolfe household, this announcement carried roughly the same weight as discovering that vandals had been redecorating the Sistine Chapel. Fritz's kitchen was his sacred domain, organized with Swiss precision and maintained with religious devotion. The idea that an unauthorized person had invaded his sanctuary was nothing short of heretical. "What kind of been in?" I asked, following him toward the scene of the crime. "Small things," Fritz said, wringing his hands as we walked. The paprika jar moved exactly 2 inches to the left. The salt cellar turned so the spout faces east instead of west. a wooden spoon in the wrong drawer, the one for stirring, not the one for serving. He paused at the kitchen entrance. And someone used the good Limoges teacup from the second shelf. I examined Fritz's evidence with the attention it deserved. His kitchen was indeed a study in meticulous organization, and the small displacements he'd noted were the kind of details that only someone who lived with that precision would notice. The teacup sat in the drying rack, clean but showing faint traces around the rim, the ghost of bergamot oil that spoke of Earl Grey tea. But there was more. A subtle chemical scent lingered in the air. Lemon oil mixed with something sharper, almost medicinal. The vinegar bottle had been moved slightly, and a fine cloth in the wastebasket carried the same lemony smell as if someone had been cleaning surfaces with professional thoroughness. "Fritz, when did you notice this?" "This morning when I came down at 6:30, everything was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but wrong enough for someone who knows his own kitchen." I checked the service entrance and basement door. Both were secure, showing no signs of tampering. The security system hadn't been triggered, which meant either someone had bypassed it entirely or they'd had legitimate access. A disturbing thought that I filed away for later consideration. The elevator's familiar whir announced Wolfe's descent from the plant rooms. When he entered the kitchen and saw our concerned faces, his eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. For him, a dramatic display of interest. "Someone has violated Fritz's domain," I explained, then detailed the small but significant displacements and the chemical evidence. Wolfe's expression darkened like a summer storm gathering force. The brownstone was more than his home. It was his fortress, his sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. Any uninvited intrusion was a personal affront that struck at the very foundation of his carefully ordered existence. "The teacup," he said, examining the Limoges piece with the same methodical attention he'd given the cracked Marie Gabrielle cup. "Someone wished to make a point about tea and porcelain. The lemon oil suggests professional cleaning, removing traces while leaving a message." "Message received," I said. "The question is who sent it and how they got in." "More importantly," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the quiet menace that appeared when someone made the mistake of threatening his peace, "what they took while they were here." That sent me straight to my desk, where a more personal violation awaited discovery. My small leather notebook, the one I used for sensitive observations and gut feelings, sat exactly where I'd left it, slightly askew as always. Too perfectly askew, perhaps. I flipped to my notes on the museum's security, specifically my diagram of Voss's office and the notation about the sticky door latch. There, beneath my original note, was the faintest pencil mark, a subtle underscoring that I definitely hadn't made. But the real prize was missing from Wolfe's desk drawer. The anonymous note that had started this whole affair, this one ended a life, was gone, along with our only sample of the typeface that might have identified its author. "Professional work," I said, showing Wolfe the evidence. "They took what they needed and left calling cards to let us know they'd been here." Arrogant but effective. Wolfe settled into his chair with the deliberate movements of a man preparing for war. "Someone has made the grave error of bringing their game into my home, Archie. This will not be repeated." The phone rang, Ms. Voss, calling to inform us that the museum had experienced its own violation overnight. Her office had been searched with the same professional discretion, and a crucial file was missing. The executive board meeting minutes that detailed all the financial pressures and personal conflicts surrounding Brand's death. "We'll be there within the hour," I told her, then turned to Wolfe. "They're covering their tracks and removing evidence. The question is whether they're hiding a real crime or manufacturing a false one." "Indeed," Wolfe replied. "But they've revealed more than they intended. The timing, the methods, the specific targets, all point to someone with intimate knowledge of both our investigation and the museum's internal operations." The ride to the Quillian Museum was tense. Wolfe lost in contemplation while I navigated Saturday traffic and wondered who had the nerve to invade our sanctuary. The museum sat on East 73rd Street like a well-dressed dowager, its limestone facade projecting the kind of understated wealth that didn't need to advertise itself. Ms. Voss met us at the staff entrance, her usual composed exterior showing hairline cracks of strain. "I'm grateful you're here early," she said, leading us through corridors lined with objects that belonged in textbooks. The violation was thorough. Her office told the story of a careful search conducted by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Papers were slightly out of order, drawers had been opened and meticulously closed, and her computer showed signs of recent use. A small jade figurine on her desk had been turned from facing the window to facing the door, a sentinel left to announce the intrusion. "The missing file?" Wolfe asked. "Executive session minutes from last month. They contained Brand's proposal to use restricted funds as loan collateral, Yuan's collection gift with naming rights, Harlan's threat to withdraw her family endowment, and Pender's concerns about authentication procedures after the Grieve incident." She paused, the implications sinking in. Everything that could reveal the real pressures behind Brand's death. Before we could process this fully, Dana Reeves appeared with news of yet another discovery. In the Green Gallery, someone had accessed the Marie Gabrielle display case, the same case that held the remaining pieces of the service from which the cracked teacup had come. Inside the teapot, visible through the spout, was a folded piece of paper. The note, when carefully extracted, contained a single typed line. "The truth is in the timing." Wolfe studied the case, the note, and the faces around us with the patient attention of a master chess player contemplating his next move. "Ms. Voss, this case was locked and alarmed after Thursday's condition check." "Yes, and the alarm system shows no unauthorized access." "Then this message was placed before the case was secured, which means our correspondent was present during the aftermath of Brand's death, had legitimate access to the displays, and has been waiting for us to discover their carefully planted clue." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Someone with authorized access, someone who'd been present during the critical moments, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate both the physical evidence and our investigation of it. "The pattern is clear," Wolfe continued, his voice carrying the certainty of deductive logic. "The kitchen invasion, the stolen note, the missing board minutes, and now this planted message, all designed to demonstrate capability while controlling the narrative. Someone wishes us to focus on the obvious suspects while they orchestrate events from the shadows." "A puppet master," I said. "Precisely. But puppet masters, Archie, are vulnerable to having their strings cut." He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each person present. "The board meeting will proceed as scheduled. But now we know we're not just investigating Brand's death. We're confronting someone who believes they can manipulate the outcome through intimidation and misdirection." As we prepared for the afternoon's confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a threshold. The case had moved from intellectual puzzle to personal challenge. Someone had invaded our sanctuary, stolen our evidence, and left their calling cards with surgical precision. But they'd also made a crucial error. They'd assumed that Nero Wolfe could be intimidated, that his investigation could be controlled through theatrical gestures and careful manipulation. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The subtle trespass had become a declaration of war, and Wolfe, immovable in his chair but implacable in his purpose, was preparing to respond with the full weight of his considerable intellect. The board meeting promised to be more than a routine governance session. It was going to be a battlefield, and the real game was about to begin. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes you think the world might actually make sense, until you open the newspaper and discover that someone has decided to conduct your investigation in the court of public opinion. The Tribune's weekend edition hit our doorstep with a tasteful black and white photograph of the Quillian Museum's limestone facade and a headline that made my coffee taste like ashes. This one ended a life. I brought the paper into the office and set it on Wolfe's desk like a cat presenting a particularly unpleasant dead mouse. Wolfe read the first 2 paragraphs with the expression he reserves for discovering that Fritz has run out of burr, then folded the paper with one decisive motion. "Someone," he said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of distant thunder, "wishes to conduct our investigation in public." The article was a masterpiece of innuendo disguised as journalism. It referenced an anonymous typed note claiming that a museum teacup had ended Cyrus Brand's life, mentioned irregularities in the museum's operations, and suggested that the medical examiner's ruling might have been premature. Only 4 entities knew the exact wording of that original note: Ms. Voss, Wolfe, and me, the thief who'd stolen it from our office, and whoever had planted the second message in the teapot. The arithmetic wasn't difficult, even for someone who'd never claimed to be a mathematician. Before I could share this observation with Wolfe, the phone began its own contribution to the morning's chaos. Ms. Voss called first, her voice stretched tight on piano wire. 3 major donors had already contacted her. One had paused contributions pending clarification, and the insurance company had placed a hold on the museum's coverage pending what they euphemistically called a risk assessment. "They're sending investigators this afternoon," she said, and I could hear the sound of a career circling the drain. "The board meeting is still scheduled for 3 o'clock, but I'm not sure how many trustees will actually attend." "They'll attend," I assured her. "Nobody wants to miss the final act of a good drama." 10 minutes later, Vincent Carstairs from the insurance company called to inform us that they were expediting a comprehensive review of the museum's policies and procedures. In plain English, they were sending people with clipboards to determine whether the Quillian was a legitimate cultural institution or an elaborate fraud operation. "The timing is unfortunate," Carstairs said with the studied neutrality of someone who'd learned never to commit to an opinion in writing. "But given the publicity and the irregularities that have come to light, we have no choice but to protect our interests." "What irregularities?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "The insurance schedule addendum we discovered yesterday. Several valuations appear to have been altered after the initial assessment. If someone was inflating values before damage occurred." He let that hang in the air like smoke from a suspicious fire. When Inspector Kramer arrived, without the courtesy of a doorbell, naturally, he brought with him the kind of thunderous scowl that suggested the Tribune article had not improved his weekend plans. "You're a private detective, not a press bureau," he announced, planting himself in front of Wolfe's desk like a monument to official irritation. "You want publicity? Buy a sandwich board." "Inspector," I said, gesturing at the folded newspaper, "we're as surprised as you are." The note was stolen from this office Thursday night. We didn't give it to anyone. Kramer's eyebrows performed a small, angry dance. "Stolen? From here?" "Professional work," I confirmed. "They took what they needed and left calling cards to let us know they'd been here. Also rearranged a few things at the museum. We're dealing with someone who enjoys making points through interior decoration." Wolfe stirred in his chair, a movement that somehow commanded attention despite its subtlety. "The press leak is bait, Mr. Kramer. Someone wishes to force speed and errors in our investigation." "The ME's report stands," Kramer said firmly. "Aneurysm, clean toxicology, no suspicious circumstances. But with this circus in the papers, the commissioner wants me to remain alert to developments." His tone suggested what he thought of commissioners and their political sensitivities. "If you pull a rabbit out of your hat, Goodwin, it better not be made of newspaper clippings." After he left, taking half the oxygen in the room with him, I called Saul Panzer with Wolfe's instructions. The response was immediate and comprehensive, as usual. "The Tribune leak came from a payphone call placed around 10:30 last night," Saul reported. Location, 5th Avenue and 74th Street, 2 blocks from Hollis Greaves' building. The caller used the exact phrase, "This one ended a life," and claimed to have internal knowledge of irregularities at the museum. Greaves' building. His doorman confirms he went out for a walk around 10:30, returned at 11. Also interesting, Greaves' Remington typewriter is sitting on his side table with a fresh ribbon. The E key prints low and to the left, same distinctive flaw as both notes. That brought my head up sharply. I pulled out my phone and checked the photograph I'd taken of the original note before its theft. Sure enough, the E and ended drooped noticeably. The second note, retrieved from the teapot, showed the same characteristic flaw. "Can you get a typing sample?" Wolfe asked. Already did. Greaves' calling card, typed with multiple E's for comparison. Same distinctive droop. The morning's revelations were building like a storm system, but the real pressure was yet to come. My phone buzzed with a text from a contact at the garage. A grey sedan had been parked across from the brownstone for 2 days running, different drivers, but the same habit of reading yesterday's newspaper while watching our front door. When I stepped out for what I claimed were routine errands, the tail picked me up within half a block. The driver was competent, but not inspired. He stayed with me through a brief walking tour of the neighborhood until I ducked into a flower shop, slipped out the back, and rejoined him at his rear bumper to inquire about his reading preferences. "Just doing a job, Mr. Goodwin," he said, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Pick a better one," I suggested, then photographed his face and license plate before returning to the brownstone. Saul's response to the images was swift and illuminating. Ray Manco, freelance surveillance specialist with a standing contract through Harland and Rayburn, the discreet private firm that handled sensitive matters for old money families. Mrs. Beatrice Harlan's family law firm used them regularly, but the day's most significant revelation came from an unexpected source. Saul's deeper investigation into the museum's financial records had uncovered something that transformed the entire landscape of the case. "Remember that missing provenance document Dr. Yuan mentioned?" Saul asked when he called back. The one for the Chinese export piece that Dr. Pender supposedly needed for insurance purposes. "Yeah, what about it?" "It's not just any piece. It's a Qing dynasty vase currently valued at approximately $10 million. But here's the interesting part. 30 years ago, that vase was owned by Cyrus Brand himself. He sold it to a holding company, which then donated it to the museum where Brand later became a trustee. The implications hit me like a cold wave. So Brand sold it low, then arranged for it to be donated back to the museum where he had influence, effectively getting a tax write-off while keeping the piece in his sphere of control? That's the theory. But it gets better. 3 months ago, Brand initiated discussions about deaccessioning underperforming assets to shore up the museum's finances. Guess which piece was at the top of his list for potential sale? The Qing dynasty vase. Exactly. And if it was sold, and anyone examined the provenance document showing Brand's prior ownership, it could raise serious questions about conflicts of interest, self-dealing, and the legitimacy of the original donation. When I relayed this information to Wolfe, his eyes opened with the predatory gleam that appears when he sensed the true heart of a case. So Mr. Brand, facing financial pressures at the museum and perhaps exposure of his own questionable dealings, was prepared to sacrifice the vase to save the institution. But someone else had different plans. And the missing provenance document is the key to everything, Archie. Without it, the vase's history remains obscure. With it, Brand's reputation would be destroyed, and anyone else involved in the original arrangement would face serious legal consequences. The afternoon board meeting promised to be more than a routine governance session. It was shaping up to be a confrontation that would determine the museum's future and possibly expose a murder. When we arrived at the Quillian, the atmosphere was thick with the particular tension that comes when people with competing agendas gather to discuss money, power, and the convenient death of someone who'd stood in everyone's way. The boardroom occupied the museum's second floor, a space designed to remind trustees that they were participating in something more elevated than mere commerce. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood, oil portraits of long-dead benefactors gazed down with painted approval, and a mahogany conference table dominated the center like an altar to civilized discourse. Ms. Voss called the meeting to order with the brittle efficiency of someone trying to maintain control while standing on quicksand. Before we address routine business, I want to acknowledge our unusual circumstances. Mr. Brand's death has left us with several unresolved issues, and we have Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Goodwin observing today to help clarify certain questions that have arisen. Dr. Pender, seated to her right, cleared his throat with academic precision. I trust we're not allowing sensationalism to overshadow our actual responsibilities. Cyrus died of natural causes, and we have a museum to run. Natural causes, Mrs. Harland repeated, her voice carrying enough frost to preserve specimens. How convenient that his death occurred just as the board was preparing to vote on his rather dramatic financial proposals. Before the discussion could deteriorate further, Dana Reeves entered with an expression that suggested she'd rather be announcing a fire drill. Ms. Voss, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been another incident. The word incident had the effect of a gunshot in the quiet room. Every conversation stopped, every face turned toward Dana with the focused attention of people who'd learned to expect bad news. The Marie Gabrielle teapot is missing from the display case, Dana announced, the one that contained the note Mr. Wolfe discovered this morning. Security shows no unauthorized access, which means someone with legitimate access removed it. Someone in this room, Wolfe observed quietly, or someone with equivalent authority. Dr. Pender stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood. This is outrageous. We're being accused of theft in our own boardroom. Are you? Wolfe asked, his tone mildly curious. I merely stated a logical conclusion. The interpretation you choose to place on that conclusion is illuminating. Mrs. Harland's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Maxwell, your guilt is showing. What followed was a revelation that transformed the meeting from routine governance to explosive confrontation. Mrs. Harland opened her purse and withdrew a manila folder with the deliberate precision of someone playing a winning hand. Since we're discussing irregularities, she said, perhaps we should address the authentication reports that don't match the pieces in question, the insurance valuations that exceed reasonable market estimates, and the correspondence between Cyrus and various financial institutions regarding loans against restricted endowment funds. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Pender demanding to see the documents, Dr. Yuan questioning their authenticity, Ms. Voss trying to restore order. Through it all, Wolfe sat perfectly still, absorbing every word, every gesture, every revelation. Cyrus gave me these copies 3 days before he died, Mrs. Harland continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. He was having second thoughts about the direction the museum was taking. He was particularly concerned about authentication, irregularities, and their potential legal consequences. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Brand had discovered systematic fraud, had been preparing to expose it, and had died before he could act on his discoveries. The missing provenance document, the altered insurance, valuations, the authentication irregularities, all pointed to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the museum's operations. Ladies and gentlemen, Wolfe said, his voice commanding immediate silence, you are discussing fraud, theft, and professional misconduct in the presence of a man who died under circumstances that are, at minimum, highly suspicious. I suggest you consider the implications of that timing. As the meeting dissolved into accusations and denials, I found myself thinking about the pattern we'd uncovered. The cracked teacup, The anonymous notes, the break-ins, the missing documents, the stolen teapot, and now the revelation of systematic institutional corruption, all orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of both the museum's operations and our investigation. Someone who'd been present during Brand's death, who had access to secure areas, who understood the significance of each piece of evidence we'd discovered. Someone who was playing a very sophisticated game of misdirection while covering their tracks with professional precision. The pressure had definitely increased, but so had the stakes. We weren't just investigating a suspicious death anymore. We were confronting a conspiracy that could destroy careers, send people to prison, and bring down one of the city's most respected cultural institutions. And somewhere in that room, the person responsible was watching us watch them, confident in their ability to stay one step ahead of our investigation. They were about to discover that underestimating Nero Wolfe was a mistake that few people got to make twice. If you want to understand how Nero Wolfe operates when he's ready to close a case, you need to appreciate that he doesn't chase his quarry. He arranges the world so that the quarry has nowhere to run except straight into his waiting hands. Sunday morning found him in his chair, motionless as a cathedral gargoyle, while the aftermath of Saturday's explosive board meeting continued to send ripples through our investigation. The difference was that now, instead of reacting to events, Wolfe was orchestrating them. The first piece of his positioning came through Saul Panzer's methodical dissection of the museum's financial records. When Saul called at 9:30, his report carried the precision of a surgeon describing a particularly complex operation. The authentication irregularities go back 18 months, Saul reported. Someone's been systematically overvaluing pieces for insurance purposes while undervaluing them for donation tax credits. The spread amounts to approximately $4 million in fraudulent claims, all starting after Tamsin Keats rejected Hollis Greaves' donation. Any pattern to the perpetrator? I asked. All the altered documents required access to both the authentication database and the insurance filing system. That limits it to 3 people. Dr. Pender as chief curator, Miss Voss as executive director, or someone with administrative override privileges. Wolfe stirred in his chair, a movement that somehow conveyed both satisfaction and inevitability. The rejected donation was the catalyst. Someone decided that if legitimate authentication was going to interfere with profitable arrangements, then authentication itself would need to be adjusted. But Saul's most significant discovery concerned the missing Qing dynasty vase provenance, the holding company that supposedly donated the vase to the museum 30 years ago. It was a shell corporation registered in Delaware, dissolved 6 months after the donation. The only signatory was a lawyer who died 15 years ago. But here's the interesting part. The incorporation papers were filed by the same law firm that currently represents the museum's board. Harland and Rayburn, I said, remembering Mrs. Harland's surveillance of our investigation. Exactly. Which means Mrs. Harland's family firm was involved in the original arrangement that allowed Brand to sell his vase, claim a tax deduction for its donation, and maintain influence over it as a trustee. The second piece of Wolfe's positioning was more theatrical. He had me rearrange the office with surgical precision. The red leather chair moved 3 inches to the left, the small stand with the cracked Marie Gabriel teacup positioned at the edge of his desk, and most significantly, an empty porcelain display ring placed at the corner where visitors' eyes would naturally fall. The absence, he explained, will speak louder than the presence. When I asked about the missing teapot, Wolfe's eyes glittered with the predatory satisfaction of a master chess player who'd anticipated his opponent's move 3 turns in advance. The person who took it believes it contains evidence that could expose them. Their belief is more valuable than the actual evidence. The third piece was a series of carefully timed appointments, each designed to increase pressure while revealing the true relationships between our suspects. Dr. Pender arrived first at 3 o'clock, his usual academic composure cracked like the porcelain that had started our investigation. "Mr. Wolfe, I must protest this atmosphere. he began, his eyes carefully avoiding the empty display ring. "The museum is under tremendous strain. The proper course is calm deliberation, not theatrical confrontations." "Dr. Pender," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you altered insurance valuations after initial assessment and sought increased coverage on the Marie Gabriel service in the week following Mr. Greaves' rejected donation. You also suggested that Ms. Keats amend her post-event report to indicate earlier observation of the teacup damage." "Why?" Pender's mouth worked silently for a moment. "Market conditions required prudent adjustments. The suggestion to Miss Keats was merely to ensure accuracy in our documentation." "Accuracy?" Wolfe repeated the word as if tasting something unpleasant. "You mean the accuracy of claiming that damage visible only after Mr. Brand's death was somehow responsible for causing that death?" "I never said—" "You didn't need to say it. You arranged for others to say it." Wolfe leaned forward slightly, and Pender actually flinched. "Tell me about the missing provenance document for the Qing dynasty vase." The question hit Pender like a physical blow. His eyes flicked to the empty display ring, then away. "It wasn't where it should have been in the archives. I'm attempting to reconstruct the documentation from secondary sources." "Indeed." "You may go, Dr. Pender, but remain available. I suspect we'll need further clarification shortly." Mrs. Harland arrived at 4 o'clock with the bearing of someone who'd spent the weekend preparing for battle. She took the red leather chair without invitation and fixed Wolfe with a stare that could have frozen champagne. "You employed surveillance on our investigation," Wolfe stated without preamble. "To what end?" "To protect the museum from sensationalism," she replied crisply. "Cyrus gave me copies of those documents because he was wavering about exposing the fraud. He feared that scandal would destroy the institution he'd devoted his life to supporting. And yet you chose to reveal those documents at yesterday's board meeting, ensuring maximum scandal and institutional damage." Her composure flickered for just an instant. "Sometimes surgery is necessary to save the patient, or to remove evidence of one's own complicity." Wolfe's tone remained conversational, but the words landed like hammer blows. "Your family's law firm arranged the original shell corporation that allowed Mr. Brand to fraudulently donate his own vase to the museum. You've known about this deception for 30 years. Mrs. Harland's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "That arrangement was perfectly legal under the tax codes of the time. Legal, perhaps. Ethical, certainly not. And when Mr. Brand decided to expose the current fraud, he risked exposing the historical fraud as well, including your family's role in facilitating it." Dr. Yuan arrived at 4:30 with his usual scholarly composure, but I noticed his eyes immediately sought the empty display ring before settling on Wolfe's face. "Dr. Yuan," Wolfe began, "your medical research into cerebral aneurysms following Mr. Brand's death was quite thorough. You consulted with neurologists about the effects of extreme stress and sudden temperature changes on blood pressure." "Academic curiosity," Yuan replied smoothly. "I wanted to understand the medical factors that contributed to Cyrus's tragic collapse." "And your conclusions?" "That extreme emotional shock, particularly when combined with hypertension, can indeed trigger catastrophic vascular events. If Cyrus had discovered systematic fraud in the institution he'd devoted years to supporting, the revelation could have been fatal. It was a masterful performance. Yuan was simultaneously confirming that Brand's death could have been induced while positioning himself as a concerned trustee seeking justice. But Wolfe wasn't finished. Your promised collection, Dr. Yuan, the Leland Yuan Gallery of Asian Ceramics. That arrangement was contingent on governance changes that Mr. Brand was advocating, including the authority to deaccession underperforming assets. Among other factors. Yes. Such as the Qing dynasty vase that Mr. Brand owned 30 years ago, sold to a shell corporation, and then had donated to the museum, where he later became a trustee. Yuan's scholarly composure finally cracked. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Dr. Yuan. I'm stating that you discovered Brand's historical fraud and used that knowledge to pressure him into supporting your collection donation. When he threatened to expose the current authentication irregularities, you realized he might also expose his own past deception and your knowledge of it. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Yuan's hands gripped the arms of his chair, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely shaken. At 5 o'clock, Ms. Voss arrived with Tamsin Keats in tow. Both women looked like they'd spent the weekend preparing for their own executions. Ms. Voss, Wolfe said, your office door latch has been unreliable for months. You believed it was locked the night the teacup disappeared, but it may not have been. I know, she said quietly. I've submitted work orders, but maintenance always has higher priorities. And Ms. Keats, you conducted the pre-event condition report on the Marie Gabrielle teacup. It was perfect then, but you didn't examine it immediately after the trustees' tea. Tamsin nodded miserably. Dr. Pender asked me to examine it the next morning, but when I went to the prep room it wasn't there. I assumed it had been returned to storage. But it hadn't been returned to storage. It had been placed in Miss Voss's office with an anonymous note claiming it had ended a life. Who had access to place it there? The two women exchanged glances. Anyone with a key, Miss Voss said. Dr. Pender, myself, Dana Reeves. Security could buzz someone in, but there would be a record. Indeed. And yesterday, the Marie Gabrielle teapot disappeared from its display case. Dr. Pender signed out the key for what he claimed was a routine condition check. Tamsin looked confused. But the teapot was already missing when he accessed the case. I saw him searching for it. That brought everyone's head up. Wolfe's eyes opened fully, and I could practically hear the gears clicking into place. Ms. Keats, you observed Dr. Pender searching the display case? Yes, sir. Around 2:30 yesterday afternoon. He seemed quite distressed that the teapot wasn't there. Then who removed it? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. If Pender hadn't taken the teapot and the security logs showed no other authorized access, then someone else had found a way to remove it without triggering the alarm system. Hollis Grieve arrived at 5:30, carrying his Remington typewriter in a leather case like a violinist bringing his instrument to a concert. His eyes were bright with the anticipation of vindication. Mr. Wolfe, he announced, I've brought the authentic instrument you requested. I trust this will help clarify the situation. Indeed it will, Mr. Grieve. Wolfe had me set the typewriter on the side table, where it looked perfectly at home. You telephoned the Tribune Friday night from a payphone near your building and provided them with the exact phrase from the anonymous note you typed and planted. Why? Grieve lifted his chin with wounded dignity. Because the Quillian has lost its way. Because fraud must be exposed and cauterized. Because that restoration specialist's rejection of my generous gift was symptomatic of an institution that values academic pedantry over genuine philanthropy. No, Wolfe said, and the single word stopped Grave's speech like a physical barrier. You did it because you were insulted. Your pride was wounded, and you decided to wound the institution in return. You are a vandal with a thesaurus, Mr. Grieve, but you are not a murderer. The room fell silent. Grieve's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his prepared speech derailed by Wolfe's casual dismissal. The notes, the Tribune leak, the theatrical placement of evidence, all designed to suggest that Mr. Brand's death was connected to the teacup. But the truth, as your second note stated, is indeed in the timing. The teacup was perfect when used at the trustees' tea. Any crack appearing afterward could not have ended a life, in the literal sense. Wolfe's gaze swept the room, taking in each face, each expression, each subtle tell that revealed guilt or innocence. Mr. Brand died of a cerebral aneurysm triggered by extreme stress and emotional shock. The medical examiner's ruling was correct, but incomplete. The question is not whether he was murdered, but whether his death was induced by someone who knew exactly how to create the conditions that would prove fatal. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then Wolfe delivered his masterstroke. In 10 minutes, Inspector Kramer will arrive with a warrant to search the museum's premises. Before he does, I'm offering one final opportunity for the person responsible to recover the missing teapot and place it on that display ring. He nodded toward the empty porcelain circle. If it appears, I will take a certain view of the situation. If it does not, I will take another. He closed his eyes, which in Wolfe's personal lexicon meant the court was in recess and everyone should consider their options carefully. I walked to the front window and spotted Fred Durkin's substantial form in the shadows across the street, along with Saul Panzer leaning casually against a lamp post. The brownstone was surrounded, not by police, but by Wolfe's own network of operatives, ensuring that no one could leave without being observed. Behind me, chairs creaked and consciences wrestled with desperation. The empty display ring sat in its prominent position, waiting for someone to make the choice between confession and continued deception. Wolfe had positioned all the pieces perfectly. The evidence was assembled, the pressure was applied, and the trap was set. Now all that remained was to see who would break first under the weight of their own guilt. The office gathering was about to begin, and the endgame was finally at hand. The 10 minutes stretched like a fuse burning toward its inevitable explosion. Every person in Wolfe's office understood that his ultimatum wasn't theatrical posturing. When Nero Wolfe offers a choice between confession and exposure, he's already arranged the world so that only one option remains viable. The empty display ring sat at the corner of his desk like an accusation waiting to be answered, while our assembled suspects shifted with the nervous energy of people who'd suddenly realized they were attending their own judgment. The mantel clock's ticking seemed to amplify with each passing minute. Dr. Pender's fingers drummed a silent rhythm on his knee. Mrs. Harland maintained her aristocratic composure, but I noticed her hands gripping her purse with white-knuckled intensity. Dr. Yuan adjusted his glasses repeatedly, his scholarly demeanor showing hairline cracks. Ms. Voss and Tamsin Keats sat rigid as violin strings, while Hollis Grieve petted his typewriter case like a cat that might purr. At exactly 9 minutes, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Tamsin Keats, pale and trembling, slowly rose from her chair. Her eyes were fixed on the empty display ring with the intensity of someone making a decision that would change everything. Miss Keats. Wolfe's voice was a soft prompt, not a question. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, Tamsin reached into the large canvas bag she carried, the kind restorers use for delicate tools and fragile materials. She withdrew a carefully wrapped bundle and, with infinite care, unwrapped the Marie Gabrielle teapot. It gleamed in the office light as she placed it on the empty ring. The collective intake of breath was audible. Dr. Pender shot to his feet, his face mottled with fury and panic. "Tamsin, what have you done?" "I found it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hidden in Dr. Pender's office, behind a stack of old catalogues. I knew it was wrong. I knew someone was trying to frame Miss Voss, or make it look like an accident. I didn't know what else to do." Wolfe's eyes opened fully, fixing on Pender with the patient attention of a cat watching a mouse hole. "So, Dr. Pender, the teapot was not missing. It was merely relocated to your office, and you performed the charade of searching for it in the display case, knowing it was not there in Miss Keats's presence. Why?" "She's lying." Pender's voice cracked with desperation. "She's trying to deflect attention from her own incompetence." "Is she?" Wolfe's tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. The insurance fraud, the altered valuations, the manipulation of Ms. Keats' reports, and now possession of stolen museum property. You orchestrated an elaborate deception, Dr. Pender, but not the one that matters most. The doorbell's insistent chiming announced Inspector Kramer's arrival. I could hear his heavy footsteps in the hall, Fritz's apologetic murmur, and the unmistakable sound of official authority preparing to intrude on our carefully orchestrated drama. Wolfe raised his hand for silence. Before Inspector Kramer joins us, permit me to clarify the actual sequence of events. Dr. Pender, your fraud was extensive but ultimately secondary. You altered authentication records, inflated insurance valuations, and attempted to manipulate the investigation's focus. But you did not kill Cyrus Brand. Pender's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The person who killed Mr. Brand, Wolfe continued, his gaze moving deliberately to Dr. Yuan, understood that the most effective murders leave no physical trace because they employ the victim's own nature as the weapon. Yuan's scholarly composure began to crumble like ancient parchment. You're suggesting murder without poison, without violence, without any physical intervention. I'm stating it, Dr. Yuan. You researched stress-induced aneurysms with academic thoroughness. You learned that extreme emotional shock, particularly in someone with severe hypertension, can trigger catastrophic vascular events. The question was how to create such shock in a controlled environment. Kramer entered the office with his usual thunderous presence, took one look at the assembled crowd, and settled into the yellow chair with a sigh that spoke volumes about his Sunday evening plans. The provenance document for the Qing dynasty vase, Wolfe continued, revealed Mr. Brand's historical fraud, his sale to a shell corporation, followed by its fraudulent donation to the museum where he later became a trustee. You discovered this deception, Dr. Yuan, and used it to pressure him into supporting your collection donation and the governance changes it required. That's preposterous speculation, Yuan protested, but his voice lacked conviction. When Mr. Brand threatened to expose the current authentication irregularities, you realized he might also expose his own past fraud, and your knowledge of it. More critically, you understood that Brand's sense of institutional honor was his greatest vulnerability. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. You arranged to meet privately with Mr. Brand during the trustees' tea, ostensibly to discuss your collection. Instead, you confronted him with the original provenance document, proof of his fraudulent donation 30 years ago. The silence was profound, broken only by the scratching of Kramer's pen. Brand's reaction was exactly what you anticipated, Wolfe continued. Shock, horror, the realization that his entire relationship with the museum had been built on deception. For a man with severe hypertension and an absolute sense of institutional honor, the emotional trauma was literally fatal. Yuan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. This is academic speculation. You have no proof such a conversation occurred. Don't I? Wolfe's smile was sharp as winter wind. The Marie Gabrielle teapot contained more than a cryptic note. When Archie examined it yesterday, he preserved paper fragments that had been folded with the typed message, fragments of the original provenance document, torn and hidden to conceal their significance. From his desk drawer, Wolfe produced a clear evidence bag containing the reassembled fragments. These pieces identify Cyrus Brand as the vase's original owner and reveal the Shell Corporation as fraudulent. Only someone with access to the complete document could have torn it so precisely, and only someone who understood its deadly significance would have hidden the fragments with a note claiming, "The truth is in the timing." Yuan's face had gone ashen. The scholarly mask was completely gone now, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who'd gambled everything on an elaborate deception and lost. "I didn't intend for him to die," Yuan said quietly, his voice carrying genuine anguish. "I showed him the document, explained the implications, the potential legal consequences. I thought if Cyrus understood what exposure would mean, for himself, for the museum, for everyone involved, he would agree to a quiet resolution." "You wanted him to choose between his conscience and his reputation," Wolfe observed. "For a man like Brand, that was no choice at all." It was a death sentence. I presented him with facts, Yuen replied hollowly. How was I to know he would react so dramatically? You researched stress-induced aneurysms, Kramer pointed out, his pen still moving. You knew exactly how he might react. The confession that followed was quiet and methodical. No theatrical breakdown, just the systematic acknowledgement of a sophisticated plan that had succeeded too well. Yuen had discovered Brand's historical fraud during his research into the museum's Asian collection. He'd used that knowledge to secure his gallery donation, but when Brand threatened to expose the current authentication irregularities, Yuen realized his entire arrangement was in jeopardy. After he collapsed, I panicked, Yuen admitted as Kramer's handcuffs clicked into place. I realized how it would look, my private meeting with him, my knowledge of his medical condition, my research into aneurysms, so I planted the evidence to suggest his death was connected to the teacup rather than our conversation. The fragments in the teapot, the note about timing, the theatrical placement of the cracked cup in Miss Voss's office, I said. All designed to create a false narrative while you destroyed the real evidence. Poetic justice, I thought, Yuen said with bitter irony. Let the investigation focus on institutional fraud rather than personal vendettas. But I underestimated both the porcelain's timing and Mr. Wolfe's deductive capabilities. As the police led Yuan away, the remaining suspects sat in stunned silence. Dr. Pender would face charges for his authentication fraud, but the greater crime, the murder of Cyrus Brand through calculated psychological shock, had been solved. Wolfe closed his eyes with the satisfaction of a master craftsman contemplating completed work. The truth was indeed in the timing, as Dr. Yuan's note stated, not the timing of the teacup's thermal damage, but the timing of his revelation to Mr. Brand. Sometimes the most effective weapon is simply the right information delivered at precisely the right moment to precisely the wrong person. After the office cleared, I found myself contemplating the cracked Marie Gabrielle teacup that had started our investigation. It sat beside the recovered teapot like a small porcelain monument to the complexity of human nature. Murder by revelation, I said, using the victim's own conscience as the murder weapon. Indeed, Archie. Dr. Yuken understood that for a man like Brand, the truth about his past deception would be more devastating than any physical assault. He simply underestimated the literal accuracy of that assessment. Fritz appeared to announce dinner, inquiring whether we might require anything special to celebrate the successful conclusion of our case. Just the usual excellence, Fritz, Wolfe replied, and perhaps we might retire the Marie Gabrielle service to positions of honor. They have served their purpose admirably. The case that had begun with a cracked teacup and an anonymous note had revealed the most sophisticated murder either of us had encountered. A killing accomplished not with poison or violence, but with truth itself, wielded by someone who understood that the most dangerous weapons are often the most subtle ones. The teacup had indeed ended a life, just not in the way anyone had expected. And in the end, it was the timing, not of thermal shock, but of moral shock, that had proven fatal to Cyrus Brand. The silence that followed Dr. Yuan's removal stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of Inspector Kramer's police car disappearing into the Manhattan traffic. The remaining occupants of Wolfe's office sat in various states of shock and calculation. Dr. Pender, pale with the realization of his exposure, Mrs. Harland maintaining her aristocratic composure despite the cracks showing beneath. Miss Voss and Tamsin Keats huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck, and Hollis Grieve clutching his typewriter case as if it might provide absolution for his wounded pride. Wolfe opened his eyes and regarded the assembled group with the patient attention of a master craftsman examining his completed work. Dr. Yuan's confession resolves the central question of Mr. Brand's death, but it does not conclude our examination of the elaborate deception that both concealed and revealed that crime. Each of you contributed threads to this tapestry of fraud and misdirection, and justice requires that we examine the full pattern. Inspector Kramer, who had remained to complete his notes, looked up from his pad with the expression of a man who'd learned to expect complications from Nero Wolfe cases. "Let's hear it, Wolfe. How deep does this rabbit hole go?" The architecture of murder. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in the gesture that meant he was about to dissect a problem with surgical precision. Dr. Yuan's method was both elegant and diabolical. He understood that the most effective murders leave no physical trace because they employ the victim's own nature as the weapon. His research into stress-induced aneurysms was not academic curiosity. It was reconnaissance for a calculated assassination. From his desk drawer, Wolfe withdrew Saul Panzer's comprehensive report on Yuan's activities. 6 weeks before Mr. Brand's death, Dr. Yuan began consulting with neurologists about the specific conditions that could trigger fatal vascular events in patients with severe hypertension. He reviewed case studies, examined medication interactions, and developed a precise understanding of the psychological pressures that could prove lethal to someone with Brand's exact medical profile. "But how do you prove psychological murder?" Dr. Pender asked, his voice strained with the desperation of a man hoping to deflect attention from his own crimes. "Through the convergence of motive, method, and opportunity," Wolfe replied. Dr. Yuan had discovered Mr. Brand's historical fraud, the Shell Corporation arrangement that allowed Brand to sell his Qing Dynasty vase and then claim a tax deduction for its fraudulent donation to the museum. This knowledge gave Yuan leverage over Brand, but when Brand threatened to expose the current authentication irregularities, Yuan realized his entire collection arrangement was in jeopardy. Wolfe gestured toward the reassembled provenance document fragments that still lay on his desk. The timing of Yuan's revelation was crucial. He chose the trustee's tea, a public setting where Brand would feel maximum shame and exposure, to confront him with the evidence of his historical deception. For a man with Brand's sense of institutional honor and severe medical condition, the psychological shock was literally fatal. The supporting cast of deception. Wolfe's gaze moved systematically to each remaining suspect, and I could see them shrinking under his analytical attention like flowers wilting in harsh sunlight. "Dr. Pender," Wolfe continued, "your role was that of the opportunistic fraud. You altered authentication records and inflated insurance valuations, creating a systematic scheme to defraud both donors and insurers. When Ms. Keats' integrity inconveniently exposed Hollis Greaves' reproduction as a fake, you decided that authentication would be whatever served your financial interests." Pender's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, but Wolfe wasn't finished. "Your theft of the Marie Gabrielle teapot from its display case was a desperate attempt to control the narrative. You hid it in your office, then performed the charade of searching for it in Ms. Keats' presence, hoping to suggest that someone else had taken it. But your manipulation of Ms. Keats, pressuring her to backdate her condition report to suggest earlier damage, was both clumsy and diagnostic of your guilt." Mrs. Harland straightened in her chair with the dignity of someone preparing to face execution. "And my role in this drama, Mr. Wolfe? Your family's law firm, Mrs. Harland, facilitated the original Shell Corporation that enabled Mr. Brand's fraudulent donation 30 years ago. When Brand threatened to expose current irregularities, he also risked exposing the historical fraud, including your family's role in enabling it." Wolfe's tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Your strategic revelation of Brand's documents at the board meeting was not altruism. It was damage control, designed to position yourself as a defender of integrity while concealing your own complicity. And the surveillance you employed on our investigation was intended to ensure that any discoveries could be managed to protect your family's reputation. You provided Dr. Yuan with valuable intelligence about our progress, inadvertently enabling his misdirection campaign." Hollis Greaves shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still clutching his typewriter case. "I suppose my contribution was merely theatrical." Your contribution, Mr. Grave, was born of wounded vanity, Wolfe replied without mercy. Your anonymous notes, typed on that distinctive Remington with its telltale drooping E, were acts of petty revenge designed to punish an institution that had dared to question your expertise. Your calculated leak to the Tribune was intended to create scandal and embarrassment. Wolfe paused, letting the weight of his words settle. What you failed to realize was that Dr. Yuan was using your theatrical gestures as camouflage for his own far more serious crime. Your misdirection provided perfect cover for his psychological murder, allowing him to hide the true weapon, the provenance document, among your fabricated clues about teacups and thermal shock. The web revealed the beauty of this case, Wolfe continued, lay in its multiple layers of deception. Each of you was pursuing your own agenda: fraud, revenge, damage control, institutional preservation, while Dr. Yuan orchestrated events from the shadows. The cracked teacup became a symbol of institutional fragility. The anonymous notes suggested external threats, and the missing documents created an atmosphere of conspiracy and cover-up. Ms. Voss, who had remained silent throughout this systematic demolition, finally found her voice. So the museum was being destroyed from within by people who claimed to be protecting it. Precisely, Ms. Voss. Dr. Pender's authentication fraud undermined the institution's scholarly integrity. Mrs. Harlan's historical complicity and strategic manipulations served her family's interests rather than the museum's. Mr. Grave's vengeful publicity campaign damaged the museum's reputation, and Dr. Yuan's murder of Mr. Brand eliminated the one person who might have exposed and corrected these systemic problems. Tamsin Keats, pale but resolute, spoke up. What happens to the museum now? That, Wolfe replied, depends on whether its remaining leadership chooses to rebuild on a foundation of integrity or continues to prioritize reputation over truth. Your courage in retrieving the teapot and presenting it here today suggests that there are still those within the institution who value authenticity over artifice. Justice in multiple forms. Inspector Kramer closed his notebook with a decisive snap. UN for murder by psychological torture. That'll be an interesting one to prosecute. Pender for fraud and theft. Grave for obstruction and malicious mischief. Harland. He looked at the aristocratic woman with something approaching pity. Her conscience will have to be her judge. The statute of limitations protects her from legal consequences, but not from moral ones. Mrs. Harland stood with the dignity of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating social consequences. I will resign from the board, of course. My family's firm will also withdraw from representing the museum. Some mistakes echo across decades, Mr. Wolfe, but they can still be acknowledged. As the office gradually emptied, Pender escorted by a uniformed officer, Grieve shuffling out with his typewriter case, Mrs. Harland departing with her head held high despite her disgrace. Ms. Voss and Tamsin Keats remained. The museum can survive this, Ms. Voss said, though her voice carried more hope than certainty, with proper leadership and genuine commitment to authenticity. Indeed, Wolfe replied. Institutions do not die from exposure to truth, Ms. Voss. They die from concealment of it. The Quillian Museum now has the opportunity to rebuild its reputation on the solid foundation of scholarly integrity rather than the shifting sands of convenient deception. The final accounting. After the last visitor departed, Fritz appeared to announce that dinner was served, inquiring whether we might require anything special to mark the successful conclusion of our case. Just the usual excellence, Fritz, Wolfe replied, and perhaps we might display the Marie Gabrielle pieces in a position of honor. They have served justice admirably, even though they were never actually instruments of murder. Looked at the cracked teacup and recovered teapot, now sitting quietly on Wolfe's desk like small porcelain monuments to the complexity of human deception. Murder by revelation, I said, using the victim's own conscience and medical condition as the weapon. Indeed, Archie. Dr. Yuen understood that for a man like Cyrus Brand, the truth about his past deception would be more devastating than any physical assault. He simply underestimated the literal accuracy of that assessment. Wolfe's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a master craftsman contemplating completed work. The most sophisticated murders are often the most subtle ones, those that employ the victim's own nature as the instrument of destruction. The case that had begun with a cracked teacup and an anonymous note had revealed layers of institutional corruption, personal vendettas, and ultimately, the most calculated murder either of us had encountered. Dr. Yuan had committed what he believed was the perfect crime, a killing that left no physical evidence because it employed purely psychological means. But he had failed to account for the one factor that always brings down the most clever criminals: the relentless logic of Nero Wolfe, applied with surgical precision to the tangled web of human motives and deceptions. The teacup had indeed ended a life, just not in the way anyone had expected. And in the end, it was not porcelain that proved fatal, but the far more fragile material of human conscience, shattered by the weight of revealed truth. Justice had been served, not just in the legal sense, but in the deeper sense of exposing and correcting the systematic corruptions that had nearly destroyed a cultural institution. The Quillian Museum would survive, but it would be forever changed, hopefully for the better. The game, as they say, was finally over. The brownstone has its own way of breathing after a case closes. When Wolfe is satisfied with the outcome, the building seems to exhale slowly and settle back into its natural rhythm like a cat that successfully defended its territory. By Tuesday morning, you could feel the old patterns reasserting themselves. Orchids from 9 to 11 and 4 to 6. Business hours for intellectual challenges that don't bore him to tears, and Fritz in the kitchen performing daily miracles with ingredients that lesser mortals would turn into mere food. The phone calls that morning carried the satisfying weight of loose ends being tied with professional precision. Inspector Kramer led off at 10:15, sounding like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with district attorneys and legal precedents. The DA's office is going with reckless endangerment resulting in death for UN, he reported, his tone suggesting what he thought of legal euphemisms. They're not comfortable with murder by conversation, even when the conversation was specifically designed to trigger a fatal medical event. But we've got enough to make it stick, his research into aneurysms, the consultations with neurologists, the timing of his revelation. The jury will understand that he pulled the trigger even if his weapon was made of words. And the supporting cast? Pender's pleading to fraud and theft charges. He'll lose his pension, but avoid serious jail time. The burglary at your place was courtesy of Ray Manco, hired through Harland and Rayburn to assess exposure. He used a maintenance code to slip your security system, photographed the note, and pocketed it as a souvenir. Your Fritz's lemon oil made it into his jacket pocket. That's how we matched him to the scene. Greaves looking at misdemeanor obstruction and a civil suit from the museum. Mrs. Harland gets to live with her conscience and her family's tarnished reputation. After Kramer hung up, Vincent Carstairs from the insurance company called with news that their investigation was wrapping up. We're lifting the hold on general coverage while opening a special file on the authentication irregularities, he said, sounding like a man who'd found religion in the form of honest bookkeeping. The good news is that robust corrective action actually lowers our risk assessment. My underwriters appreciate institutional integrity. It's cheaper than fraud in the long run. The museum's renaissance. The most encouraging call came from Ms. Voss, who sounded like someone who discovered that surviving a crisis could actually strengthen an institution rather than destroy it. The board unanimously approved our reform package, she reported, her voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been there during the investigation. Independent authentication audit, public transparency report, and a complete moratorium on deaccessions pending the review. We're also implementing new security protocols and expanding our conservation department. And Tamsin Keats? Promoted to interim chief curator with full authority to stop any transaction that doesn't meet her standards. She's already identified 3 other pieces with questionable authentication records, and she's working directly with the insurance company to establish new verification procedures. The board gave her a budget increase and a mandate to hire additional staff. The institutional changes went deeper than personnel shuffles. 2 new trustees had been appointed to replace Mrs. Harland and Dr. Yuan, both with impeccable scholarly credentials and no financial interests beyond their commitment to preserving decorative arts for future generations. The Leland Yuan Gallery of Asian Ceramics would never be built, but the museum's collection would continue to be displayed and studied without the taint of personal aggrandizement. Saul Panzer stopped by in the afternoon to deliver his final report, looking like a bloodhound who'd successfully tracked his quarry to ground. The registrar found a microfilm copy of the original Qing vase provenance in a mislabeled storage box, he told us, settling into the red leather chair with satisfaction. It's fuzzy but usable, enough for the DA and the IRS to triangulate the Shell Corporation fraud and close the historical loop. Won't bring Brand back, but it prevents anyone else from claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding. The museum's financial situation? Stabilizing. 3 major donors who'd paused contributions are resuming support, and 2 new foundations have expressed interest in funding the authentication audit. Turns out that transparency and accountability are attractive qualities in cultural institutions. Who knew? The return to excellence. By 6 o'clock, the brownstone had shed its temporary role as a stage for human folly and reverted to its true calling, a sanctuary dedicated to the finer things in life. Fritz appeared in the office doorway with the announcement that dinner was served, his face radiating the particular satisfaction that comes from maintaining civilized standards in an uncivilized world. The dining room table was set with the brownstone's finest china and crystal, a subtle celebration of order restored and justice served. Fritz had prepared medallions of veal with morel mushrooms, accompanied by a burgundy that had been waiting in the cellar for just such an occasion. The aroma alone was enough to convince you that civilization was worth defending. As we settled into our chairs, Wolfe raised his wine glass in an unusual gesture of acknowledgement. "To the Marie Gabrielle Teacup," he said solemnly, "which ended a life not through any fault of its own, but by serving as the catalyst for exposing the fault lines in human character that made such an ending inevitable." I raised my own glass. "And to the restoration specialist who had the courage to tell the truth about a fake donation, even when it threatened her career and social standing." Indeed. Integrity, Archie, is like fine porcelain. It appears fragile, but properly maintained, it can survive pressures that would shatter more obviously robust materials. The dinner that followed was one of Fritz's masterpieces, each course a testament to the possibility of perfection in an imperfect world. The veal was tender enough to cut with a fork, the mushrooms earthy and complex, the wine a perfect complement to both food and conversation. Philosophical reflections. Only after the last morsel had been properly appreciated did Wolfe lean back in his chair and address the deeper implications of our recently concluded case. "The human capacity for self-deception," he observed, "is perhaps our species' most remarkable talent." Dr. Yuan convinced himself that he was preserving culture and scholarship when he was actually committing murder. Dr. Pender believed he was protecting the museum when he was systematically defrauding it. Mrs. Harland thought she was defending institutional integrity when she was concealing her own family's corruption. And Mr. Grieve? Mr. Grieve was the most honest of them all. He admitted his motive was simple revenge. There's something almost refreshing about uncomplicated malice in a case filled with elaborate self-justification. I helped myself to Fritz's lemon tart, contemplating the peculiar nature of our work. "Murder by revelation," I said. "Using truth itself as a weapon. It's almost poetic in its way. The victim's own conscience becomes the instrument of destruction." The most dangerous lies, Archie, are not those we tell others, but those we tell ourselves. Each of our suspects had constructed elaborate internal narratives to justify behavior they knew was wrong. When those narratives collapsed under the weight of exposure, the psychological shock proved literally fatal in Mr. Brand's case. Wolfe accepted his own portion of tart, a rare indulgence that signaled his complete satisfaction with the day's proceedings. The constant struggle is to maintain order in a world perpetually striving for chaos. My home, my routines, my orchids, they are bulwarks against the inherent disorder of human affairs. This case, with its layers of calculated deception and ultimate unraveling, reaffirms the necessity of vigilance. The final accounting. As Fritz cleared the table and prepared coffee, I found myself thinking about the cracked Marie Gabrielle teacup that had started our investigation. It now sat in a place of honor on Wolfe's desk, its hairline fracture catching the lamplight like a reminder that even damaged things could serve justice. Thermal shock, I said, picking up the thread of our earlier conversation. A sudden temperature change that creates stress fractures. Not unlike what happened to the people in this case when they were exposed to sudden truths they weren't prepared to handle. An apt metaphor, Wolfe agreed. Dr. Yuan understood that the most effective way to destroy something fragile is not through brute force, but through the application of precisely the right pressure at exactly the right moment. His mistake was assuming that theatrical misdirection could substitute for genuine cleverness. The evening wound down with a particular satisfaction that comes when justice has been served. Bills have been paid, and Fritz has once again proven that civilization is worth preserving. The case that had begun with a cracked teacup and an anonymous note had revealed layers of institutional corruption, personal vendettas, and ultimately the most sophisticated murder either of us had encountered. As I prepared to turn off the office lights, I took one last look at the Marie Gabrielle pieces in their velvet-lined box. They were no longer evidence in a murder investigation, but symbols of something more important, the idea that truth, however painful, is ultimately more valuable than the comfortable lies we tell ourselves. "Well, boss," I said, pausing at the office door. "Another case closed, another lesson learned. This one taught me that sometimes the deadliest thing you can serve a man isn't what you put in his cup, but what you take out of his peace of mind." Wolfe grunted, a sound that could mean anything from mild amusement to profound agreement. He was already reaching for his evening book, ready to return to the intellectual pleasures that made the sordid realities of human nature bearable. The brownstone settled into its familiar, comforting silence. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, but within these walls, the rhythm of orchids, fine food, and the occasional precise application of intellectual justice would prevail. The case of the teacup that ended a life was closed, but its lessons would linger. That the most sophisticated crimes often employ the simplest weapons, that institutional corruption breeds in darkness and dies in light, and that sometimes the most important victory is not solving the crime, but restoring the integrity that prevents the next one. The world outside could scheme and deceive all it wanted. Inside the brownstone, order had been restored, justice had been served, and Fritz was already planning tomorrow's menu. In Nero Wolfe's universe, that was as close to perfection as mortal beings were likely to achieve, and I, Archie Goodwin, would be here to document every perfectly timed, subtly delivered, and ultimately devastating move. You'd think after a case winds up with handcuffs, confessions, and the kind of publicity that makes museum trustees reach for their smelling salts, the brownstone would snap back to its monastic routine like a rubber band. Usually it does. This time took longer. A murder by conversation leaves a different residue than bullets or blades. It's quieter, more persistent, and it changes the way you listen to people's words. By the third Wednesday after Dr. Yuan's arrest, the familiar rhythms had mostly reclaimed their territory. Wolfe gave his orchids their daily sermon from 9 to 11 and 4 to 6. Fritz coaxed miracles from ingredients that lesser mortals would turn into mere food, and I handled the correspondence from people who suddenly remembered they'd always believed in institutional integrity. The world loves a sinner who repents, especially when they can attach their name to the redemption. The morning mail brought a small package with my name typed on the label. Same drooping eye that had started our adventure, but this time from a friend. Inside was a brass door latch, tarnished but functional, with a card in Dana Reeves's careful handwriting. For your collection of cautionary tales. The new one closes properly. A relic, I told Wolfe, who was reading a monograph on Mediterranean herbs as if it owed him money. Put it somewhere you'll trip over it when you grow complacent, he said without looking up. The fates of players. Inspector Kramer stopped by Thursday morning with his final report, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd successfully prosecuted a murder committed entirely through conversation. UN got 15 to 25 for reckless endangerment, resulting in death, he announced, settling into the red leather chair. The judge was particularly unimpressed with the premeditation. All that research into stress-induced aneurysms made it clear this wasn't a crime of passion. His scholarly reputation is finished. 3 universities revoked honorary degrees, and his book on Chinese ceramics got pulled from publication. And the supporting cast? Pender pleaded out to 18 months plus full restitution. He's banned from working in any museum or auction house. Professional death sentence in his field. Grave got community service and a restraining order keeping him away from the Quillian. His real punishment is living with the knowledge that his wounded vanity nearly provided cover for murder. Kramer's expression grew thoughtful. Mrs. Harlan's the interesting case. No criminal charges. Statute of limitations protects her from the historical fraud. But she resigned from 4 museum boards and made a $5 million donation to fund authentication audits. Sometimes conscience is a harsher judge than any court. The museum's Renaissance Ms. Voss called that afternoon with news that the Quillian was not just surviving, but thriving. Tamsin's been promoted to chief curator with full authority to challenge any attribution that doesn't meet her standards. She reported, her voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been there during our investigation. She's already identified 8 additional pieces with questionable provenance, and instead of hiding the discoveries, we're making them the centerpiece of an exhibition on authentication challenges. The transformation was remarkable. The museum that had nearly been destroyed by scandal was becoming a model of institutional integrity. Attendance had increased, donations were flowing again, and other museums were sending delegations to study their reform process. The Marie Gabriel service is now permanently displayed with complete documentation of its role in the investigation, Ms. Voss continued. Visitors love the story, how a cracked teacup helped expose a sophisticated murder. We've turned our brush with scandal into an educational opportunity, philosophical interlude. That evening, as Fritz announced dinner with his usual ceremonial precision, Wolfe emerged from his post-orchid contemplation with the air of a man who'd reached certain conclusions about human nature. "The case troubles you," he observed, as we settled at the dining table, where Fritz had prepared medallions of veal with a sauce that could have made philosophers weep. "The method troubles me," I admitted. "Using truth itself as a murder weapon, it's almost elegant in its way." "Elegance is not the word I would choose." Wolfe cut his veal with surgical precision. Dr. Yuen understood that the most effective way to destroy something fragile is not through brute force, but through the application of precisely the right pressure at exactly the right moment. His mistake was assuming that theatrical misdirection could substitute for genuine cleverness. He paused to appreciate Fritz's sauce, then continued. "The human capacity for self-deception is perhaps our species' most remarkable talent. Each of our suspects had constructed elaborate internal narratives to justify behavior they knew was wrong. When those narratives collapsed under the weight of exposure, the psychological shock proved literally fatal in Brand's case. The lasting impact. 6 months later, Saul Panzer's final report arrived, a masterpiece of investigative analysis that had been adopted by the FBI's art crime team as a model for detecting institutional fraud. His work on the Quillian case had exposed similar schemes at 3 other museums, leading to a broader investigation of authentication irregularities in the art world. The case had also sparked reforms throughout the cultural community. Museums began implementing independent authentication reviews, boards adopted stricter conflict of interest policies, and conservation professionals found their expertise valued over diplomatic considerations. Tamsin Keats became something of a celebrity in museum circles. Her willingness to challenge accepted attributions held up as a model of professional courage. She declined several lucrative offers from major institutions, choosing instead to help rebuild the Quillians' reputation from within. The final word. As I write this account, nearly a year after the case closed, the cracked Marie Gabrielle teacup still sits on Wolfe's desk, its hairline fracture catching the lamplight like a reminder that even damaged things can serve justice. It's become more than evidence. It's a symbol of the idea that integrity, however fragile it may appear, is ultimately stronger than the forces that would corrupt it. The brownstone has returned to its familiar rhythms, but the lessons linger. We've learned to look beyond obvious crimes to the institutional failures that make them possible. We've discovered that the most dangerous criminals are often those who believe their motives justify their methods. And we've confirmed that the most effective weapon against sophisticated deception is not dramatic confrontation, but patient, methodical exposure of truth. Late one evening, as I prepared to turn off the office lights, Wolfe spoke without opening his eyes. Remember, Archie, truth is not a condiment. It must be the meal, or it is merely an affectation. Spoken like a man whose dessert is waiting, I replied. Precisely. The case that began with a teacup that ended a life had revealed something more significant, that the most important victories are often the quietest ones, the prevention of future crimes through the exposure of present corruption, the restoration of institutional integrity through individual courage, and the triumph of truth over the comfortable lies that institutions tell themselves. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace. Inside the brownstone, order had been restored, justice had been served, and Fritz was already planning tomorrow's menu. In Nero Wolfe's universe, that was as close to perfection as mortal beings were likely to achieve. The teacup sat quietly in its place of honor, cracked but whole, a testament to the enduring power of truth properly applied. And I, Archie Goodwin, would be here to document every perfectly timed, subtly delivered, and ultimately devastating revelation that justice might require. The game, as they say, was finally and completely over.